The Pacific wind carried a salty tang across the quiet beaches of California, where dawn broke over rolling surf and misted cliffs. Seagulls circled lazily above deserted piers, their cries swallowed by the gentle roar of the ocean. In the distance, the horizon blurred, concealing shapes that might have been ships, or the imagination of those scanning the waters for signs of danger. Across the coastline, towns stirred slowly, unaware of the shadow of a war that had so far remained oceans away. The American mainland, vast and confident, seemed untouchable. Yet in this alternate 1942, uncertainty hung in the air like a heavy fog. Naval intelligence had been strained, its reports fragmented as code-breaking efforts struggled to predict the full reach of Japanese ambitions. Military installations, scattered along the west coast, were lightly reinforced, their garrisons untested against an amphibious assault of unprecedented scale. Every harbor, every inlet, every stretch of sand became a potential stage for a confrontation that could redraw the map of the war. In those first moments, before the first planes roared overhead and the first troops set foot on foreign soil, the nation's sense of security felt fragile. The coastline held its breath, suspended between the reality of isolation and the possibility of invasion, as the Pacific silently waited to reveal a world that Americans had never imagined. In early 1942, the United States was still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor, its Pacific fleet damaged but far from destroyed, and its industrial engine only beginning to shift into full wartime production. Across the Pacific, Japan had secured a series of rapid victories, seizing territories from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, consolidating resources, and establishing forward bases that stretched their operational reach. These gains gave the Imperial Japanese Navy unprecedented mobility, allowing them to project power across thousands of miles of ocean. Yet the American mainland remained largely untested, defended by a patchwork of coastal fortifications, National Guard units, and hastily mobilized army divisions, many of which had never seen combat. In this fragile balance, even a small misstep or an audacious plan could have tipped the scales toward disaster. Japan's military planners, emboldened by their string of successes, considered ambitious operations to strike beyond the Pacific Islands, exploring the feasibility of hitting the continental United States directly. Reconnaissance flights, submarine patrols, and intelligence reports focused on West Coast ports and critical infrastructure, from shipyards in San Francisco to oil fields in California and Oregon. These assessments highlighted vulnerabilities, untested defenses, dispersed forces, and a public unprepared for the possibility of invasion. In theory, a concentrated amphibious assault, supported by carrier aircraft and submarines, could establish beachheads, disrupt supply lines, and create chaos long enough for Japan to exploit initial gains. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Britain struggled to hold its ground against the Axis advance, and American attention was divided between Europe and the Pacific. Military leaders debated the allocation of scarce resources, reinforcing coastal defenses versus building fleets for long-range operations. Civilian populations, accustomed to peacetime life, faced rationing, air raid drills, and uncertainty as newspapers hinted at threats far from home. The nation's response mechanisms, mobilization, communication, and emergency planning, were evolving, but had yet to be tested in the crucible of direct attack. In this context, the idea of a Japanese landing on American soil was not merely hypothetical. It was a scenario grounded in the logistical realities, strategic ambitions, and technological capabilities of both nations in early 1942. The human dimension of a Japanese invasion would have been immediate and profound. Coastal communities, from fishing villages to urban centers, faced the prospect of sudden occupation, displacement, and civilian casualties. Families who had believed the war was distant suddenly confronted the fragility of their daily routines. Emergency evacuations, shortages of food and fuel, and the terror of artillery and aerial bombardment would have tested the resilience of civilians untrained for combat. National morale, a critical factor in sustaining military and industrial effort, would have wavered under the psychological weight of invasion. Americans unaccustomed to war on their own soil would have been forced to reconcile fear with determination, shaping a social response that blended improvisation, solidarity, and at times, panic. From a tactical standpoint, the United States faced significant disadvantages in the early months of 1942. Coastal defenses were incomplete, radar coverage limited, and rapid troop deployment hampered by underdeveloped transportation networks and inexperienced military leadership. Japanese planners, by contrast, had honed their amphibious assault doctrine through campaigns in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, coordinating naval, air, and ground forces to achieve swift, decisive landings. A successful beachhead would have allowed them to disrupt supply lines, seize strategic ports, and create localized superiority before American forces could regroup. Every decision, from reconnaissance to the timing of naval bombardment, carried the potential to magnify gains or expose vulnerabilities in both forces. Technology, too, played a pivotal role. Japanese carriers and long-range bombers could strike deep inland, targeting infrastructure, factories, and military depots. Submarine warfare threatened maritime logistics, potentially isolating coastal reinforcements and creating a temporary stranglehold on essential supplies. Conversely, American industrial capacity, though immense, required time to convert to wartime output. Radar, early warning systems, and communication networks offered advantages, but gaps in coverage and the novelty of large-scale homeland defense meant that technological superiority alone would not guarantee security. The interplay of innovation, deployment, and logistics defined the potential outcomes of an engagement that could have reshaped the continental theater. Leadership under such circumstances would have been tested to the extreme. Japanese commanders needed precise coordination across vast distances, while American generals faced unprecedented pressure to defend territory against a well-trained, highly motivated foe. Strategic priorities, whether to protect urban centers, key military installations, or population hubs, forced impossible choices, with consequences magnified by the speed of enemy operations. Political leadership, too, would have confronted the dual challenge of maintaining public morale and directing military resources effectively, balancing urgency with pragmatism in a situation with no historical precedent. The moral dimension of an invasion added yet another layer of complexity. Civilians caught in combat zones, prisoners of war, and occupied territories would face ethical dilemmas and human suffering of a scale never experienced on American soil. Decisions about resistance, surrender, or collaboration would carry profound consequences, shaping the character of communities long after the immediate conflict ended. The confrontation between national survival and individual safety, between military necessity and human cost, would have created moral pressures that tested the values and resilience of both societies. The decisive moment of a hypothetical Japanese invasion would have begun with the first wave of amphibious landings along the West Coast, likely targeting lightly defended beaches near major ports. Carrier-based aircraft would have swept inland, neutralizing coastal defenses and disrupting communication lines, while transports disgorged infantry, engineers, and artillery. Initial landings, if unopposed with full coordination, could have established small but secure beachheads, allowing the Japanese forces to bring in reinforcements before American units could organize a coherent counterattack. The psychological impact of seeing foreign troops on American soil, combined with the rapidity of operations, would have intensified confusion and delayed civilian evacuation efforts. Every hour counted, and the outcome depended on speed, coordination, and the ability to exploit initial gains before the industrial and military might of the United States could respond. As days turned into weeks, the clash would have expanded to urban centers and critical infrastructure. Ports, rail junctions, and airfields became strategic prizes, with each side seeking to control supply lines and mobility. Japanese forces, trained in aggressive small-unit tactics and coordinated assaults, would have faced American defenders relying on hastily mobilized militias, National Guard units, and regular Army formations. Skirmishes around key facilities determined whether beachheads could be reinforced or isolated, and whether inland advances were sustainable. The interplay of terrain, logistics, and local knowledge would have magnified the stakes of every engagement. While high command on both sides struggled to anticipate enemy movements with incomplete intelligence. Naval and air power would have shaped the broader strategic picture. Japanese submarines patrolled shipping lanes, threatening reinforcements and supplies. Carrier groups extended operational reach, conducting strikes that prevented consolidation of American forces. Conversely, American aircraft factories and shipyards, though initially vulnerable, began producing replacements at unprecedented speed. Commanders faced a race between momentum and production, between the immediate advantages of a bold assault and the long-term capacity of a nation's industrial backbone. In this balance lay the ultimate pivot point. If the invaders failed to secure decisive objectives before American mobilization took full effect, the invasion could stall and collapse under counterattacks. If they succeeded, the trajectory of the war in the Pacific and on the home front would shift dramatically. The human element remained central. Soldiers on both sides endured extreme fatigue, supply shortages, and constant uncertainty. Civilians faced bombardment, occupation, and displacement, their choices influencing resistance, sabotage, or survival. Political leaders contended with panic, strategic dilemmas, and public perception, making decisions that could accelerate or forestall victory every moment. From the first landing to the potential consolidation of territory, carried consequences that echoed far beyond immediate casualties. By the time the first fortified city fell, or the first counterattack was launched, the war's character on the American mainland had been irrevocably altered, defining a turning point whose effects would reverberate across continents, industries, and generations. In the aftermath of a Japanese invasion, the United States would have confronted immediate and profound consequences across military, civilian, and economic domains. Coastal cities and infrastructure, from ports to railways and airfields, would have suffered extensive damage, with repair and recovery efforts complicated by ongoing threats from naval and air forces. Civilian casualties, displacement, and the disruption of daily life would have generated widespread humanitarian challenges, stretching the capacity of emergency services and military relief efforts. Communities along the West Coast would have faced the psychological burden of occupation, with fear, uncertainty, and the visible presence of foreign forces altering social dynamics and local governance. The immediate shock would have tested the resilience of both civilians and military units, forcing improvisation in response to an unprecedented homeland invasion. Strategically, the United States would have been forced to divert massive resources to stabilize the mainland, slowing operations in other theaters of the war. Troops would have been redeployed from training camps and overseas deployments to counterattacks, while the Navy and Army Air Forces focused on regaining control of ports and securing supply lines. Japanese forces, if able to establish beachheads, or control critical hubs, would have enjoyed temporary operational superiority, complicating American mobilization and coordination. Intelligence networks, emergency communication systems, and logistical planning would have been strained, highlighting both vulnerabilities and the adaptive capacity of the American military and industrial apparatus. The pace of decision-making under fire would determine whether counteroffensives could succeed or whether localized losses expanded into broader territorial threats. Economically, the invasion would have disrupted production, transportation, and resource allocation, particularly along the West Coast. Shipyards, aircraft factories, and oil refineries, key components of America's industrial war effort, would have faced damage or occupation, slowing the supply of war materiel. However, the United States' vast inland industrial base and ability to mobilize civilian labor quickly would mitigate long-term collapse, illustrating the tension between immediate disruption and strategic resilience. Technological development, including radar, aircraft design, and naval weapons, would have been affected by the need to prioritize defense of the homeland, temporarily delaying some innovations while accelerating others critical for repelling the invaders. In this dynamic, the interplay of damage, adaptation, and industrial capacity shaped the trajectory of the conflict. Politically and socially, the invasion would have galvanized national unity even amid fear. Public morale, initially shaken, would find expression in mass mobilization, volunteerism, and expanded military recruitment. Civil defense programs, rationing, and emergency planning would have intensified, creating a society structured around survival and resistance. Leadership at federal and state levels would confront ethical and practical challenges, balancing civilian protection, military necessity, and long-term strategic objectives. The human cost, casualties, psychological trauma, and disruption of normal life, would leave a lasting imprint on communities, shaping attitudes toward military service, government authority, and national identity. Across these dimensions, the aftermath of the invasion reveals not only the fragility of security, but also the capacity of a nation to endure and adapt under extraordinary circumstances. As the dust settled along the battered coastline, a quiet resolve began to emerge from the chaos. Cities, though scarred, still stood. Factories, though disrupted, still produced. And civilians, though terrified, still carried on. The invasion, whether repelled or contained, had revealed the vulnerabilities of a nation that had long believed itself untouchable. And yet, it had also illuminated the resilience embedded within its people. In every makeshift fortification, every hastily organized defense, and every act of ordinary courage, the contours of survival and determination became clear. History in this scenario serves as both warning and reflection that even the most secure nations are fragile, and that the outcome of war is shaped as much by human endurance as by strategy or technology. The coastline, once peaceful, now bore the imprint of what might have been, a reminder that the course of conflict is never fixed. And as the sun rose over the Pacific horizon, the nation looked forward, tempered by fear, yet strengthened by experience, aware that the true measure of power lies not only in what armies can seize, but in what societies can endure, rebuild, and carry forward into the uncertain days ahead.